Today, I'm going to explain an American horror thriller film from 2017, titled Get Out. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. Movie opens with a black guy, named Dre, is walking alone at night through a perfectly manicured suburban street. A little white car pulls up and starts slowly tracking him. Dre gets spooked, and changes directions to briskly walk back the way he came. When he turns to see what the car did, he sees it's parked where it was, but the door is open. From out of nowhere, a man in a knight's helmet attacks the guy, and drags his body to the car, and drive away. 6 months later, Chris has shown up. He is a photographer, and getting ready to go away for the weekend to visit her girlfriend, Rose's family. But he's concerned that they don't know she's dating a black guy. She assures him that, why they will likely say some stupid things. Whereas they will like him because they aren't racist. Later, on the ride to her parents' home, Chris goes for a cigarette, but Rose takes it and throws it out the window. Her parents would really frown on her dating a smoker. Chris then calls his buddy Rod, a TSA agent, and reminds him to take care of his dog, and not to feed him human food. Rod busts his balls about going to visit his white girlfriend's family, and says it's a bad idea. He also flirts with Rose a little bit. Chris gets a little jealous and Rose thinks it's sweet. While they're deep in conversation and not entirely paying attention to the road, a deer darts out in front of the car and is hit. They pull over to investigate and call the police. The police show up and ask what they're doing in the area. Rose tells him that they're visiting her family. The officer asks to see Chris's ID, but Rose steps in and says that because he wasn't driving there's no need for that. The officer then let them go. Chris and Rose arrive at her parents' home. Her dad, Dean, is an affable neurosurgeon, while her mom, Missy, a strangely cold hypnotherapist. The family also have 2 on-site black helpers. There's Walter the groundskeeper, and Georgina the maid. Dean acknowledges that it looks bad, 2 wealthy white people having 2 helpers who are black, but they were hired to take care of his parents and Dean would have felt bad letting them go. Dean gives Chris a tour of the house and shows him old family photos. His dad was beat out by Jesse Owens to compete in the Olympics in front of Hitler. And while that was sad for his dad, it was still great to have Hitler's Aryan idealism proven wrong. He taps on the basement door and says it's closed off due to black mold. There is also pictures of Rose's brother. He's a surgeon like his dad, but he went through a rough patch. The family gets together for afternoon tea. Missy offers to cure Chris of his nicotine addiction through hypnosis, but he doesn't feel cool with people tooling around in his head. She asks about his parents. His dad left when he was young, while his mom was hit by a car when he was 11. Dean tells Rose that they're having their big party tomorrow. She's surprised and they remind her that it's the same day every year. Georgina sort of short circuits while pouring tea, and Missy tells her to get some rest. Rose's brother, Jeremy, arrives. He's an aggressively dickish rich kid. That night the family has dinner, and a drunk Jeremy starts talking to Chris about MMA fighting. He says that because Chris comes from a hardy stock he'd be a natural. He wants to spar, but Chris says that he has rules about play fighting with drunks. Missy then tells Jeremy that maybe it's time for him to go to bed. Chris and Rose retire to their room, where she apologizes for her family, and they go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Chris gets up, and decides to sneak out for a smoking. While outside he sees something in the distance charging him. It's Walter. He heads straight for Chris, but makes a sharp turn at the last moment and runs off in another direction. Inside the house, Georgina is staring out a window. It turns out she's looking at her own reflection, not Chris. She adjusts her hair and Chris decides to head back inside. Before Chris can make it back to his room, Missy turns on a light and startles him. She tells him that smoking is a bad habit and offers again to help. He sits down and mocks the notion of hypnotism, unaware of the fact that she's slowly hypnotizing him, while using her teaspoon as a focus object. She takes him back to when he was 11 on the night his mom died. She didn't come home from work and he was too scared to do anything about it. He was afraid that if he called the police it would make it real. So he just sat there watching television, nervously digging his nails into his bedposts. Present time Chris is doing the same thing, digging his nails into the arms of the chair. She tells him to sink down and 11-year-old Chris sinks into his bed, while present-day Chris sinks into blackness, seeing himself and Missy far above. His consciousness has left his body, while his body is still paralyzed on chair. Chris wakes in the morning, and find everything alright. He then checks his phone. Rod has sent Chris a picture of him pretending to give his dog beer. His battery is low, so he plugs it in. Chris later tells Rose that he thinks maybe her mom hypnotized him last night. He has vague recollections of the evening. Later, the family's wealthy friends start to show up for the big party. It's mostly older white people, who say a lot of inappropriate things to Chris, like how he has a good build, because Tiger Woods golfs he must have a good swing too, and black is in fashion, etc. Chris goes back to mingling with the guests and discovers another black guy. It's a young guy about his age. Chris tries to bond with him, who is introduced as Logan, the husband of a white woman clearly way older than him, but he too is stiff and unnatural like Walter and Georgina. Chris sneaks off and finds a blind man named Jim who says that all the people at the party are ignorant, then decides to check in with Rod again. As he walks away through guests, everyone start to look at him suspiciously. When he returns to his phone, he finds it unplugged. Rose finds him and he tells her how weird everything is, and that his phone was unplugged. She tells him he's just being paranoid because he's in an uncomfortable situation. He agrees and she leaves. He plugs his phone in and calls Rod to tell him everything that's been going on. Rod tells him that white people love to have sex slaves, and he needs to get out of there. Rod then tells Chris to take a picture of the black guy and he'll see if they find him. As Chris is about to leave, he's blocked by Georgina, who apologizes for unplugging his cell phone. She was dusting the nightstand and lifted it up. That's when it came unplugged and she didn't want to mess with it further. He says that it's fine and hopes that he didn't mean to snitch on her. She doesn't understand. She gets super weird and keeps walking closer to him, and lets out a single tear while smiling. And then turns and quickly leaves. Chris goes back outside, and tries to discreetly take the familiar black man's picture with his cell phone, but has forgotten to turn off the flash. As soon as his phone flashes, the man changes. He goes from overly prim and proper to raving. His nose starts bleeding and he jumps at Chris, yelling him to get out. Get out as soon as he can. Rose too is freaked out now. She asks her dad what happened, and he explains that the flash just caused the man to have a seizure. The man comes out and apologizes for upsetting everyone, and says he must return home. Dean says it's time for sparklers and bingo and asks Chris and Rose to join, but Chris and Rose go for a walk, where Chris tells her that he's sure he recognizes the guy, and that something strange is definitely going on. She too agrees. They later talk about his mother's death, and how he would never abandon her. Chris says that he'd really like to go home now. Rose reluctantly agrees. She says she'll make up something to tell her parents. Back at the house, a strange quiet bingo game is going on. Dean holds up a number on his fingers, and some of the guests hold up cards that show bingos on them already. Slow pan out reveals that Dean is holding an auction with his guests, and next to him is a framed picture of Chris. The bingo cards are the paddles and Dean goes up to 10 fingers, and Jim has won the auction. Chris and Rose goes back to pack his belongings, and find all guests are leaving. While everyone's smiling, including Walter and Georgina. As Chris gets in room, he gets a call from Rod, who tells him that the guy in the picture is a guy they knew, who used to work at a movie theater named Dre. However, Chris's phone battery dies. Chris then notices the closet door is open. He looks inside and finds a red box, filled with photos of Rose posed romantically with many other black guys. Not just guys, there are photos of her with both Walter and Georgina who don't look at all like the robotic versions of themselves. Apparently Chris isn't the first black guy Rose has been with after all. Rose returns, and Chris says that he needs the keys to put their bags in the car. She looks for them in her purse as they make their way out of the house. However, Jeremy has blocked the door. Missy and Dean are too there. Jeremy is ready to attack, but Missy and Dean tell him to calm down. Chris keeps telling Rose to get the keys while she's looking. Missy and Dean don't want Chris to leave. Chris yells at Rose to find the keys again, and Rose stops and looks at him and says very calmly that, "You know I can't give you the keys." And shows him the keys were in her hand the entire time. She's too in whatever this is. Chris then attacks on Jeremy, but Missy clinks his teaspoon on her glass, causing Chris to sink back into the dark void again. As he sinks back into the void, he hears Missy tell Jeremy to grab his legs so they can take him to the basement. Rose then come into view and tell Chris that he was one of her favorites and blows him a kiss. While Rod keeps trying to call Chris, but it keeps going straight to voicemail. He looks up the picture of the guy in the photo and sees that he went missing some time ago. So he goes to the police. He tells a female officer that Chris was kidnapped by white folk to be a sex slave, just like the missing guy in the picture. She calls in 2 more officers to listen to Rod's story. When he finishes, they all burst out laughing. No one is going to take him seriously. Later, Chris wakes to find himself tied to a chair in front of a mounted deer head, and an old TV. He watches a video made by Dean's father, that talks about immortality and stuff like that. Then teacup and spoon appear on the screen. Ting 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 and he's out. Outside, Rod tries Chris's phone again, and Rose answers. She says that Chris left 2 days ago and is concerned too. He left in a taxi or an Uber, but forgot his phone. Rod tells her that he went to the police and she seems concerned about this. Rod starts to realize that something is wrong, so he tries to record the call. When he goes back to talking to her, Rose has realized about recording. She tells him she knows that he has the hots for her, and start to flirt with him. He tells her she's a crazy bitch and hangs up. Chris again wakes up, and Jim is on the screen. He tells Chris that they're going to swap their brains. The other people at the party were all about being black, but Jim couldn't give less of a shit about that. What he really wants is to be able to see the world through Chris's eyes. Dean has perfected the neurosurgery to make this all possible. And Missy hypnotizes the body donors to prepare them for the procedure. He'll continue existing in the dark void, but will be able to continue on as sort of a passenger. The flashing is an unfortunate side effect as they saw earlier at the party. Chris asks why only black people. Jim answers that they think black guys are more stronger. The TV then goes off, and Chris sees that his fingernails have clawed through the leather arm of the chair and exposed the padding. Later, the teacup and spoon appear on the screen again. Ting ting ting, and Chris is out again. Dean and Jeremy then prepare Jim for a brain transplant. Dean tells Jeremy to go get Chris. Jeremy goes down the hall. We see now we're in the basement of the house. He finds Chris unconscious. He takes of his restraints, and gets an 4 ready. While Chris gets up, and hits hard on Jeremy's head, and knocks out. Chris wasn't unconscious after all, he stuffed the padding from the chair in his ears to block the sound of the teaspoon. Dean starts calling for Jeremy and goes out of the lab area to check on him. Chris rushes him and impales him with the deer antlers. He knocks over a candle that ignites the blanket covering Jim too. Rose has earbuds in and isn't aware any of this is going on. She is listening songs, while looking up NCAA prospects on the internet as their next target. Chris goes upstairs and finds Missy. She goes for the teacup and spoon, but Chris beats her and smashes them. Instead she attacks him with a knife. But he turns it on her, and stabs her. Chris goes for the front door again, but Jeremy has returned and puts him in a chokehold. Chris stabs knife in his leg, and breaks free, and kills Jeremy too. He runs outside and gets in Jeremy's car. On the passenger seat is the medieval helmet from earlier. He starts down the driveway, but hits Georgina. He can't just let her lay there like his mom did, so he gets her in the car and continues down the driveway. While Rose hears and runs down the steps of the house with the shotgun, and whispers Grandma. Soon Georgina's wig falls off and we see she has a scar across her head from a brain transplant too. She wakes up and attacks him, yelling that he has destroyed his family. In the chaos, they crash into a tree and she dies. Georgina was the vessel in which Rose's grandmother's brain was housed. Rose then shoots again but misses Chris. From out of nowhere, Walter runs in, and Rose saying get him Grandpa. Walter tackles Chris. During the struggle, Chris grabs his phone and takes picture that flashes. Walter gets up, nose bleeding, and turns to Rose and says I'll take care of him. Obviously this is Rose's grandfather's brain in Walter, because she hands him the shotgun, but he shoots Rose in the stomach. Then turns it on himself and kills himself. Chris slowly gets up hurt from the car crash and the attack from Walter. He sees that Rose is still alive and is trying to get the gun. He moves the gun and crawls over on top of her and begins to choke her. She starts saying I love you while being choked, and starts to grin because he is getting too upset to go through with it. Then the police lights appear on the road. Chris gets off of her and puts his hands up. Rose starts weakly calling out for help. The car door opens and is revealed to be a TSA patrol car. It's Rod. Chris gets in the car and Rose finally succumbs to her wounds. After a moment of silence, Rod tells him that he had warned him not to go in that house. He asks Rod how did he know where he was. He tells him because he works for the TSA, this is what they do. They drive off with Rod staring out into the darkness, while Rose takes her last breath. Well, that's it for the day. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.